Today, we're looking at the Douglas B-18, a product of poor timing, poor politics, and a poor budget. Additionally, this video is very kindly sponsored by Surfshark VPN. For those who don't know, Surfshark is an app and browser extension that lets you set the digital location of your phone or computer to anywhere in the world. In a nutshell, it means you can be in Australia, but have access to the internet as if you were in the United States, which can help you get around some incredibly annoying restrictions. Take Dunkirk, for example, which is one of my favourite wartime films of recent years. I can't view it on Netflix where I am in Australia, however I know for a fact it's available elsewhere. So I switch over to Surfshark VPN and change my location to, let's say, San Francisco. And oh look, there it is. Once again, I can enjoy the sound of Spitfires, Stukas, and of course Hans Zimmer's amazing soundtrack. But having my own VPN isn't just about avoiding regional barriers, much like how a Panzer division would avoid the Maginot Line. It also protects me when I do my research. Sometimes I have to dig around some very old or poorly maintained websites to find certain scraps of information, and surprisingly enough, I don't want my data to be read by those sort of systems. With military-grade encryption, all of my data is blurred by Surfshark so that I can browse these websites in peace without them browsing me in return. So if you'd like to give Surfshark a go and binge-watch documentaries to your heart's content, or perhaps research some obscure plane knowing that your personal information is not being scanned by a questionable website, then you can use the code REX following the link in the video description below. This will give you an 83% discount, plus the first 3 months of your subscription for free. Once again, thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video, and now, let's talk about the B-18. In the early 1930s, the effects of the Great Depression were being keenly felt. Military spending was being reduced across the board, and an increasingly isolationist public opinion made it very hard to justify the development of any sort of heavy bomber. This was further compounded when, in 1934, a board was set up to evaluate the role of military aviation, and their unanimous statement can be quoted as saying, "Independent air missions have little effect upon the issue of battle, and none at all upon the outcome of the war." Unfortunately, the officers of the Army Air Corps did not possess the gifts of foresight to show said board that, yes, actually, military aviation would have significant impacts on future wars. And so, when the development success of the Martin B-10 revolutionized American bomber design overnight, the Army Air Corps found itself in the position of possessing technical innovation without the means to properly make use of it. And so, in 1934, it was in the midst of this money-conscious, non-air power-minded, and strategically inept atmosphere that the Air Corps announced a new competition for the development of a multi-engine bomber. Their specification required a bomber capable of carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs over a range of no less than 1,020 miles, and up to a hoped-for maximum range of 2,200 miles. The top speed was to be at least 200 miles an hour, though ideally they were looking for something that could achieve speeds more along the lines of 250 miles an hour. The specification did not set out an exact requirement for engine number, and as a result of this, submissions would include both 2-engine and 4-engine designs. Instead of starting out with a completely new design, Douglas based their twin-engine bomber on the existing and successful airframe that was the DC-2 transport. Designated as the DB-1, or Douglas Bomber 1, this aircraft was basically designed around the wings of the DC-2 and was fitted with a deeper and wider fuselage to accommodate an internal bomb bay. The design also featured enlarged tail surfaces, and the span and area of its wings were increased by adding rounded tips. To manage the task of carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs and all the other relevant military equipment, an upgrade in power plant was also required. The DB-1 was powered by a pair of Wright R1820 G5 Cyclone engines. These each had a power output of 850 horsepower, and to make the aircraft less visible at night, they both had single collector exhausts that went over the wing rather than under it. The aircraft was planned for operation by a 6-man crew, including 2 pilots, a navigator and bomb aimer, and 3 gunners. In terms of defensive armament, the DB-1 was to be armed with 3 .30-caliber machine guns, 1 in the nose, 1 in a dorsal turret, and 1 in a ventral hatch. Aside from the physical changes, such as the bomb bay and the enlargement of the flight surfaces, the general construction of the aircraft was essentially the same, with the same aluminium alloy used for the structure of the wings and the fuselage, and the fuselage itself had the same semi-monocoque structure found on the DC-2. And so when the DB-1 was completed in April of 1935, it resembled a slightly shorter, slightly wider, and slightly more aggressive version of the DC-2. After completing manufacturer trials, the DB-1 was sent to Wright Field for official evaluation against the competing aircraft. These consisted of the Martin 146, an enlarged and more streamlined development of their successful B-10, and the Boeing Model 299, which was the prototype for the B-17 Flying Fortress. It is here that the money-conscious attitude and thinly veiled political rivalries within the War Department come into play. On paper, and in terms of performance figures, the Boeing prototype should have been the clear winner. It had a longer range, had a better defensive armament, could carry more bombs, and it was substantially faster. However, the DB-1, based on an already existing design under mass production, was priced to the Army Air Corps at a cost that was 40% cheaper than the Boeing. And so the competition quickly boiled down to a choice between quality and quantity. The technical staff recommended the acquisition of a smaller number of Boeings, while the general staff, pointing out that the DB-1's performance, though worse than the Boeing, still fully met the Air Corps specification, wanted to purchase a larger number of the Douglas bombers. This debate went on for some time until the crash of the Boeing prototype at Wright Field, the result of an unhappy moment when it took off with the controls still locked. The General Staff used this incident as further justification for a more conservative and budget-friendly approach to procurement, and an order was placed for 133 Douglas B-18s, while a smaller order was placed for just 13 of the Boeing YB-17. Following the completion of evaluations at Wright Field, the original prototype was returned to Douglas and brought up to production standard. 2 years later, it was modified to test the feasibility and effects of firing a heavy cannon. For this purpose, it was equipped with a 75mm field gun that was mounted in a fixed position in the bomb bay. Following initial tests on the ground, where it didn't immediately explode, it was then assigned for in-flight firing tests, during which it was quickly realized that the vibration and force of the cannon being fired was not going to be handled well by the airframe, and these tests were quickly halted. Nonetheless, the results of these tests would prove valuable, and indeed they directly aided in the development of the cannon-armed B-25s that would be used during the Second World War. The production B-18 differed from the DB-1 prototype in a number of ways, though none of these changes could be considered major. They were now powered by a pair of more powerful Wright Cyclones, producing 930 horsepower, and these were housed in improved cowlings and drove a newer, wider-bladed pair of 3-blade propellers. All but 2 of the first production batch also had a redesigned nose cone. This was reduced in length by 7 inches, and now featured both side windows and a bomb-aiming window in the lower front section. Deliveries of the B-18 began in early 1937, with the first arriving on February the 23rd. The first 4 of these aircraft would be assigned for testing at various sites across the United States. The 5th, 6th, and 7th aircraft to be built were the first B-18s to be delivered to an operational unit, this being the 7th Bombardment Group at Hamilton Field, and they would later be joined by 30 additional aircraft. The remaining 94 B-18s were assigned across various bombardment groups, as well as a pair of reconnaissance squadrons. Later on, most of these units either had their B-18 supplemented or replaced by the updated B-18A, while some groups continued to operate a mix of the two, and by 1940, most bomber squadrons were equipped with B-18s. The B-18A was the most produced model by a considerable margin, with a final production run of 217 units that were ordered over 3 batches. The most notable change was yet another modification to the nose, with the bomb aimer's station being moved upward under an extended glazed housing, and the forward gun was now mounted in a ball-shaped turret that was set further back and below than on the previous model. Other modifications on the 18A included the installation of 2 1,000 horsepower Wright Cyclones, and some general upgrades in equipment and instrumentation. Ironically, for an aircraft being marketed as budget-friendly, the B-18 failed to secure much in the way of export orders. During 1938, the British Air Ministry expressed interest in purchasing the B-18 for use as a maritime reconnaissance and bombing aircraft. However, upon further inspection, the aircraft was found to be underpowered and undergunned compared to other emerging designs, and the asking price of $109,000 per unit was received poorly. After insulting the British, Douglas found itself surprised when it received more favourable attention from the Canadians. 20 aircraft were ordered for the RCAF, and they were designated as the Digby Mark I. These were ordered as reconnaissance bombers and were externally similar to the B-18A. However, they would feature .303 caliber machine guns instead of the .30 caliber ones, and other British and Canadian equipment would be fitted, no doubt including some sort of kettle. Despite being reliable and generally well liked by their crews, the Digby and B-18A were not long off the production line before their days were numbered. As the 1930s came to an end, the General Staff of the Air Corps finally recognised that larger, four-engine bombers would be the future of frontline units, and it also realised that the rapid advancement in fighter technology overseas meant that the idea of even using the B-18s for frontline bombing missions was nothing short of suicidal. As a result, no further production orders for the B-18 were placed, leaving the final production total at 350 planes. That being said, the B-18s, though obsolete, were still the most numerous bombers fielded outside the continental United States by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, they would not see a lot of use in the Pacific as, well, most of them happened to be at Pearl Harbor on the day of said attack, with most of them being destroyed on the ground, courtesy of strafing dive bombers and Zeros. The operational use of the B-18 in general did not last long during the war. However, 122 aircraft were modified for anti-submarine operations as the B-18B. The bombardier station was replaced with a search radar, and magnetic detection equipment was installed in a stinger-like protrusion at the end of the tail. The offensive load normally included depth charges carried in the bomb bay, but tests and limited use was also made with retro bomb racks beneath the wings, which fire the bombs backward in a spread pattern. In this new role, the B-18 was not unsuccessful, and it was one of the first American planes to sink a German U-boat, taking out U-654 in August of 1942. Along with Canadian-operated Digbys, the B-18 would spend most of 1942 harassing enemy submarines, usually in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast. After being replaced by B-24s in 1943, some B-18Bs were used to develop radar bombing techniques, but most were relegated to the roles of training or transport aircraft. 3 B-18s were also transferred to Brazil and used with a training unit as part of the Lend-Lease provision. Like many other B-18s, these were also eventually converted for anti-submarine use. And in May of 1943, one of these Brazilian B-18s engaged a German U-boat using depth charges and bombs. And although there was a sizable oil patch left on the sea, the U-boat kill was strangely never confirmed. After the war, the surviving B-18s that were still airworthy were often sold off as surplus, with some operated as commercial transports in various countries, including Australia and Canada. Some of these aircraft were still operated in military units as well, but this did not last long, and the last units operated in Canada and Brazil were both retired from service by the end of 1946. Today, 5 examples survive in good condition, with the potential recovery of a 6th airframe still on the table, it being a wreck on private land in Hawaii. Ultimately, the B-18 was not a particularly bad aircraft, but it was the product of poor foresight, and once again it showed that converting a civilian aircraft for military use as a bomber rarely produced great success. It also showed Douglas that if they wanted to develop successful frontline bombers, they needed to have the size and the range for such a task. This consideration would soon lead to the development of the huge and experimental XB-19. But that's a story for another day. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.